Hi witches! So today we are going to talk a little bit about ancestor work, which is something that a lot of people have asked me about, and it's honestly not a practice that I am super involved in, but I am also learning about. So as someone who is in the beginning stages of learning about ancestor work, I wanted just to share some things that really helped me, so maybe they can inspire you or help you. So yes, my knowledge is limited, but these are some things that worked for me, and I hope they work for you too. So the first thing that I really think is important is setting aside the proper amount of time and space. Your ancestors really deserve respect and love, and it's important to prioritize them if you are interested in pursuing this form of worship. So, setting aside the same amount of time that you might for a deity to talk to your ancestors or to venerate and remember and honor your ancestors. Now, in my experience, ancestor veneration has been a little bit less work intensive than perhaps deity work. However, that is only my experience. I personally really love making altars, so I have an ancestor altar in the works. I just need a few more pieces, and I will totally show you guys once I have that set up. But I do have like a shelf that I have made myself and consecrated, and you might want to include things such as pictures, mementos, notes, maybe with their handwriting on it, things that remind you of your ancestors if you know them directly, maybe a grandparent, a great uncle, great aunt, great grandparent perhaps. So having their pictures up, or maybe some cultural items if you are unsure about your ancestry. I'm not super close with my family, so doing some of this research is a little bit difficult, and my knowledge of my family members is pretty limited. If you guys don't know, I went no contact with one of my parents like 4 years ago, so it's not like I can exactly call them up and be like, hey, what did grandma say about blah, 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 blah. So for me, it's more like learning about my heritage and learning about some of the cultural things that were important to that side of my family, right? Now, part of this, and this kind of moves on to topic number 2, is connecting through the kitchen. And I think I've talked about this in the past, but lots of traditions are passed down through food. So if you have a recipe, or maybe you can think about this, but do you have a recipe that you make every year or that reminds you of a family member? Like, did grandma have a super good chocolate chip cookie recipe? Maybe you can find it and make it and kind of connect with her that way. Alternatively, maybe you don't really know too much about your family's past, but are a parent yourself. What are some traditions that you want to have with your children that you can start making those memories now and laying down those foundations now? So ancestor work doesn't necessarily have to be only looking into the past. It can be, what is the legacy that you want to leave for your kids too? So yeah, just something to think about. But it's also good to kind of understand some of the history behind the food. Why are those ingredients being used? And maybe what are some of those magical correspondences, if you so choose. Now, I find this method really great for green witches and kitchen witches, so if that is super interesting to you, really, I love the idea of like dissecting recipes and really using them to connect back with like your ancestors, just because food is such like an important thing in our lives, and can be very culturally significant as well. So oftentimes, if you're not sure where to start with the food. Now, speaking of cultures and studying history, it is like important to acknowledge that sometimes our ancestors were incredibly problematic. And you don't need to work with those problematic ancestors if you don't want to, but it is important to learn about the history of the time that they were alive, the impact perhaps of these ancestors, and maybe work through and come to terms with some of those unsavory deeds in order for you to not repeat the cycle or make the same errors as they have, right? Some people refer to this as breaking a generational curse, and it is a lot of hard work. Next, if you are privileged to have grandparents still alive, maybe consider spending some time with them to learn more about the people that you're descended from. I know both my grandparents are really into genealogy, and I'm really lucky to be able to have kind of a pretty much complete or relatively fleshed out family tree for that side of my family. And it's been really cool to kind of see who I'm descended from and some of the similarities between like my life and the life of some of my ancestors. I'm just like, oh, you also worked in fashion. Interesting. Also menswear? Weird. Okay. So it was kind of neat to be able to see like pictures of like old stores and like old family photos and like all these like cool things from like the Victorian times that somehow have stayed preserved. So I'm really lucky to have grandparents that are still like alive and able to talk to me about that kind of stuff, but I totally understand if that is not your circumstance, and don't feel like you have to have grandparents or elderly relatives in order to practice ancestor work properly. There are so many options for connecting back with your heritage, with your ancestors, so don't worry about it. And then I guess my last piece of advice, and this kind of just like comes from like generally being a witch, but I do feel like sometimes people are afraid to start. So if that describes you, just start, you got this. So some common ways of venerating your ancestors for the first time and stuff that I've done so far: lighting candles, burning some incense, and maybe leaving a simple offering such as kind of like the first bites of a home-cooked meal, which is what I did. Those have all been really well accepted, but I urge you to consider, of course, your own ancestral practices of ancestor worship or ancestor veneration. So again, I am a novice when it comes to ancestor work. However, these are some of the kind of observations that I've made or some notes that I've taken as I have practiced and done my research about practicing ancestor work. And if there's one thing that I've really taken away from my experience so far, is that the transformation of death really kind of puts things into perspective from some people. So if you're worried about maybe being contacted by a, relative who isn't super happy that you're a witch, I would not be as concerned about it, but that being said, please always be magically protected whenever you're practicing in whatever method. That's my little spiel for today. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!